This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Well, Mary, thank you very much for letting me come, and I'm really delighted and thrilled to have three classes together. How many of you are involved in the China political aspect? Raise your hands. And how many in the filming of women and other things? Not many, just a few. Okay. So I'll concentrate more on politics than I do films. Is that okay? Well, I was in China my first time before most of you were born, maybe almost all of you were born, in 1949. I was a submarine officer, and in April of 1949, my submarine went to the coast of China, and we operated in just the seaports, obviously, because that was the only place that a submarine could reach. First of all, we needed water under and around us, but secondly, it was the only place that the nationalist Chinese still existed. And every time we went into a different seaport, we could see the campfires of Mao Zedong's forces on the hillsides. And they were just permitting Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces to remain temporarily in the seaports. And we were never did know when that change was going to take place. So as we went in and every night or every end of every week's operation and tied up at the docks, we always turned our submarine around, headed out to sea so we could get underway in a hurry if we had to leave. And it was just a few weeks after that the nationalist Chinese left China, went to Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China was born. How many of you know what date it was? Raise your hand. What date was it? 1st of October, which was my birthday, right? So later when I began to negotiate with Deng Xiaoping, he and I both thought that fate had brought us together since his nation was formed on my birthday. And so that's been a very good operation for us. Later, I became very intrigued with China because I saw the inevitability of the People's Republic of China taking over the role of, quote, China. As far as the United States and many other Western countries were concerned, Taiwan was still the China. And you have to remember that in the United States and other places then, communist had a very derogatory meaning. Kind of like terrorist now, but Red China was a very bad phrase to use. And there were some witch hunts in America in politics, headed by Gene McCarthy, who condemned people who had been at all favorable toward the People's Republic of China or Red China or Communist China. And so I was very deeply interested in that process and thought that McCarthy was a criminal, which he was a U.S. senator, and he was a criminal in my opinion still. But anyway, I was fascinated with China then. The main interest that I had in China quite early, even before 1949, was as a child, because I was a devout Baptist Christian, and the number one heroes in my life were missionaries that went to represent Christianity in China. And when one of them would come back to the United States, it was an achievement of great note if we could get one of those missionaries to come to our church or come to our county or even our state to make a talk about what was going on in China in that highly secret place for us with the little children in China. And I gave 5 cents a week of my earnings to help build schools and hospitals for Chinese children. So there was an intimate relationship there in my early life with China. When I became president later on in 1977, even before I was president, I had resolved to further the steps that had been taken in 1972 when Richard Nixon went to China. I was familiar with that trip before it took place in a strange way. One of the key supporters of then Senator Ted Kennedy had come to see me quite early in 72, late in 71, to tell me that Ted Kennedy was planning a surprise visit to China. But his visit was later preempted when Kissinger went first and then when Nixon went. So Ted Kennedy's plan to make a big political splash by going to China was aborted, you might say, by Nixon's visit to China in '72. And in Shanghai, when he met with the Chinese leader, Zhou Enlai, and others, it was declared that there was one China, that Taiwan was part of China, but there was no move made for the United States officially to recognize China. So then from 1972 until 1978, the China for the United States was still Taiwan. And I thought that was a serious opportunity for the United States to make major strides in several ways. One was to recognize, obviously, the China that represented the vast majority of Chinese people, that is, on the mainland. Secondly, to acknowledge the importance of the United States forming a friendly relationship with the powerhouse in Asia in many ways, challenged only perhaps by Japan economically. And I thought that that would help stabilize the situation in the Western Pacific and help to prevent wars and also to provide economic stability or continuity. And the third thing was that we were involved in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And everything that the United States did around the world, you might say, in every country on earth, it was a competition between the United States and the Soviets about who could have the best friendship with that little country or big country, who could have better trade relationships with them, who could provide them with weapons and that sort of thing. So we were in intense competition with the Soviet Union. Both of us had major nuclear arsenals. China had a much smaller nuclear arsenal at that time, along with Great Britain and France. And I saw that our reaching out to China in a friendly way would give us a major advantage, you might say, over the Soviet Union, because prior to that, the Soviets and China had been pretty well tied together through their Communist Party commitments. And the Soviets and China had both supported, as you know, the Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh's party of the Vietnamese in the Vietnamese War, and also had supported the North Koreans in the Korean War. I was still in a submarine force during the Korean War and in the Pacific, and I looked upon China and North Korea as kind of a military opponent of the United States. So I decided to normalize relations, and I chose my representative to go to Beijing to be one of those that could negotiate best. And it was who, Steve? Leonard Woodcock. Leonard Woodcock was the former head of the United Automobile Workers, and he was recognized in our country as the best negotiator in America. He didn't know very much about international affairs. I didn't care about that. I wanted the best negotiator I could find, and so I went to Leonard Woodcock and sent him over to Beijing to be my representative. In a very secret way, Deng Xiaoping and I began to negotiate with each other directly. I never sent a single message through the State Department. All the messages that I sent to Leonard Woodcock in Beijing was sent directly from the White House, because at that time the Taiwan lobby, so-called, was extremely powerful in the United States, because Taiwan, representing China, had very close ties with the news media and with American corporations and everybody else, because it was not possible then, before normalization, for the United States forces of different kinds, economic and political and so forth, to have ties with Communist China. So this was a very important thing for me to keep it secret. I did not want anyone to know what I was contemplating, except a very few close advisors. We didn't make much progress at first, but we continued our negotiations, and the main issue was what to do about Taiwan. And I was willing to reject or abandon our diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And I was willing to withdraw American military forces from Taiwan. But we had a peace treaty with Taiwan that had a clause in it that required at least a one-year notice before it could be terminated. And of course, I didn't want the Taiwanese to know I was negotiating with Deng Xiaoping either. So that was the way we negotiated. And I finally agreed to reassert that there was only one China. The China was the People's Republic of China. Taiwan was a state in China. And I insisted that Deng Xiaoping not contradict me when I announced publicly that any differences between China, the mainland, and Taiwan would be resolved peacefully. And I also agreed not to send Taiwan any weapons except defensive in nature. So those were some of the things that were very important. We had a lot of claims, financial claims against China from American property that was taken over by the communists when they prevailed over the nationalist Chinese, and many other things of that kind that were matters of argument and contention. We were making very slow, steady, kind of frustrating progress until the 1st of December 1978, when I got a message back from Deng Xiaoping that he was willing to accept all of my proposals. And so we agreed quite hastily in the next 10 days that we would announce on the 15th day of December 1978 that full diplomatic relations would be established between the United States and China, and that would be our only relationships with China on a diplomatic nature, that we would abandon our former ties with Taiwan. And that was the 15th day of December. So simultaneously in Beijing from Deng Xiaoping and in Washington from me, we made the announcement, which caught everybody by surprise. 3 days later, closely related to that 15 December announcement, on the 18th of December, U.S. time, Deng Xiaoping also announced a major reform movement in China. And that has transformed the domestic climate and society and social structure of China. So there's no doubt that normalizing relations with the United States and completely reforming the political and economic system of China announcement came with closely tied together. I wanted Deng Xiaoping to visit the United States someday, so I sent him a kind of a perfunctory invitation. Why don't you come and visit the United States someday? And he said, I'll be there in January, which was next month. So you can imagine the consternation in Washington, and I guess all over China too, when Deng Xiaoping didn't even delay at all in making plans to come over here. So he came over here in January, and it was one of the finest visits that we ever had. Very exciting visits, and very friendly in every way, and we resolved all of our issues. There were some secret matters that related to Vietnam, where I've just returned from Vietnam and China this past week. But one of the things that Deng Xiaoping told me early in the morning was he wanted just me and him and the interpreter there, that he was planning to invade Vietnam. And I tried to tell him, please don't do it. And he said, I've got to do it to teach Vietnam a lesson. And I said, well, if you've got to do it, please don't penetrate deeply, don't stay there long. And he said, I won't stay there but just a few days. So he did invade Vietnam, and he withdrew, I think, within a month. But he taught them a lesson. So we had some very good interrelationships. In retrospect, one of the most important things that occurred between me and Deng Xiaoping was one night at a state banquet. He said, Mr. President, you've done a lot for China, and you haven't ever asked me anything. Is there anything I could do personally for you? And I said, yes, there is, as a matter of fact. You don't permit worship in China, and you don't permit Bibles to be distributed in China, and you don't permit missionaries to come to China. And I wish that you would guarantee freedom of religion and permit Bibles and let missionaries come back. He said, I'll give you my answer later. So we had breakfast together the next morning, and Deng Xiaoping said, I will agree to 2 out of 3 of your requests. We will guarantee freedom of religion, and we'll let Bibles come back, no missionaries. Because when they were here, all the way during the previous century, they lived like kings. They were very superior to other Chinese citizens, and they tried to change the culture of our people, and we will not let any foreigners come in to China to proselytize our people. So that was a very important issue. I couldn't go over to China at his request on a return visit while I was president because the Iranians were holding our hostages and I didn't leave the country. But the following year, in August of 1981, I went to China as Deng Xiaoping's personal guest. I did a lot of singing. I did a lot of dancing. I drank a lot of Mao Tai. We had a great time. Everywhere we went, there was a big banquet. I was the most famous foreigner that ever went to China because all of the TV clips of Deng Xiaoping and me together in China, they replayed on the television there before I got there. So everybody on the street recognized me and my wife Rosa, and also Amy, who was our daughter then. And so we had a great time. Deng Xiaoping had just initiated the new economic changes that he had announced in December of 1978. Free enterprise. Very strictly limited just to farmers, and certain farmers at that. So he wanted me to go to 4 or 5 places in the interior of China where farmers only were permitted to have one free enterprise. And that could be either be 5 chickens or 5 pigs, or they could manufacture clay pots and sell them for a profit, or they could repair bicycles for a profit. That was it. And in a little village nearby that might have 1,000 people, they couldn't have any free enterprise. It was limited just to the farmers. And he also permitted around the edges of the communal farms, farmers to have maybe 15% of the land that was not very productive. And when I was over there in 1981, Deng Xiaoping told me that the farmers were taking great advantage of it. He said if a communal pig gets sick, the farmers go to bed. If the farmer's pig gets sick, he stays up all night and makes sure it survives. And he said sometimes those farmers made as much on the 15% of wasteland as they did on the 85% of productive land. But it was from that beginning in 1981 that the free enterprise has now spread through China. China in the last 30 years has been totally transformed. I think one of the most interesting things that I know of is that in one of the major cities in China, it used to be just a small part of its city where foreigners lived, and when I was there, there was nothing but people all dressed exactly the same and riding bicycles, and now it's the traffic jams are the major problem, and it's Shanghai. And Rosa and I rode from downtown Shanghai to the airport on the fastest train in the world, 310 miles an hour. So that kind of gives you a transportation picture of what's happened in China in the last 30 years. Everywhere that we go on Carter Center business now, or I do on any other kind of business, there is China. In every developing nation in the world. In the rest of Asia, in the Pacific, and South America, and Africa, China is there. Very deeply involved in economic affairs, primarily. Quite generous in giving financial aid to struggling governments. Sometimes giving a free gift, like if a small country in Southern Africa, is going to have a football, soccer tournament. China will go in and give them a brand new soccer stadium, and will pay for it and have Chinese workers go in and build it, and so forth. And in addition, in return for that, China is very interested in acquiring long-term access to raw materials, oil, zinc, copper, gold, timber, iron, and so forth. And so China is making deep investments economically and politically, and I don't have any doubt that this trend will continue. As you know, China has had the most remarkable success with its economic system. In the last number of years, they've averaged about 10% annual increase in gross national product. and it's probably the fastest and most steady growth of any country in the world. It's been totally transformed. And I think this year it'll probably be 8%, but the United States is practically nothing. China has also become very deeply committed to economic growth, depending on the use of coal and oil and other petroleum products, and has now become the #1 producer of carbon dioxide in the world, and is contributing to the problem with global warming. At the same time, on a per capita basis, on a per person basis, the United States still produces about 4 times as much carbon dioxide as does China. A big argument that's going to come up in Copenhagen in just a few days is what to do about global warming. And although the Europeans have been in the forefront of this debate, the two key players everybody acknowledges in Copenhagen will be China and the United States of America. So in many ways, China has made great progress, but also has now adopted or acquired some of the problems that fall on leading nations on earth and also leading nations economically. I have a very great friendship toward China and the Chinese people. Since Deng Xiaoping, I've known all the leaders. I go there once or twice a year. I always meet with the top leaders. I talk to them quite frankly about different things. I make speeches in the major universities concerning my call for human rights and democracy in China. The Carter Center has been involved in China, this is the last thing I'll say, for a number of years. Shortly after I made my 1981 visit to China, the Carter Center was inaugurated, and when I went to China, we wanted to do something for the Chinese people. And the Chinese communists were not accustomed to having other countries do favors for them on a personal basis. And I kind of insisted. And Deng Xiaoping finally told me that the Carter Center could do 2 projects. One was related to paraplegic people without arms or legs or with damaged arms and legs. His son, as you may know, Deng Pufang, I think was his name, had been injured in the Cultural Revolution, pushed out of a 3rd-story window, and he was a triple paraplegic. He came over to the Carter Center. But Deng Xiaoping let the Carter Center help design and prepare a major manufacturing plant to produce advanced prostheses, artificial arms and legs and wrist joints and so forth, of the highest possible quality. And my wife and I went over to the dedication of the large factory in the heart of Beijing. The other thing that the Chinese let us do was to teach about several hundred education specialists on how to educate little children in elementary school who were deaf and blind. So we did this, and then those specialists went all over China and taught teachers in the schools how to teach deaf and blind kids. Later, Deng Xiaoping in 1982 had authorized in the National People's Congress, what we would consider the Constitution, not only freedom of religion, but also to authorize little villages to have democratic elections. And he asked the Carter Center later on to come over and work with their government agency in implementing that new law. And 5 years later, they made it mandatory that the little villages comply with democratic elections. And as you probably know, the little villages, there are about 600,000 of them that have 900 million people in them, don't belong to the Communist Party system. That begins at the township level, a large city level, and then it goes to counties and provinces. So the little villages are outside the Communist Party system. And Deng Xiaoping told my wife that he was not trying to democratize China. He just didn't want the Communist Party to be bothered with potholes in the streets and improper non-performing teachers and pear trees dying and things of that kind, and the collection of garbage. He wanted the little villages to be responsible for that. But anyway, the Carter Center has done that now for more than 10 years. And the little village elections on paper are perfect. The original law was revised about 1995 or so, and the Carter Center was deeply involved in bringing the law up to date. Every person in a little village is automatically registered to vote when they reach the age of 18, men and women. You don't have to be a member of the Communist Party. In fact, the vast majority of Chinese are not. You can run for office for 3 years, what we would call mayor and city council. They elect 5 people, one of whom is chosen to be the leader. And it's an absolutely secret vote. And we have been to a number of the voting procedures. And everybody in the little villages brings their little stool to the village square, and the candidates for public office gets up and make a speech limited to about 2 or 3 minutes each, and then they sit down, and then the people come up and vote secretly, and then they sit back down, and then they dump the ballots out on the table and count them one by one and mark it on a blackboard up there, and the one that gets the most votes are sworn in right then, and they become the new leaders of the village. And they serve for 3 years, and they can run for re-election after 3 years. In most cases, they tape record the speeches that the candidates make, and they replay them 3 years later. So there's a pretty big turnover in the people who hold office because they don't keep their promises. If they promise that they're going to have a certain thing done and they don't do it, then they're voted out of office. And most of the campaign platform planks are devoted to economy. We're going to plant 500 pear trees and sell the pears in the big cities. Or we're going to take part of our corn and make cornstarch out of it. Or we're going to have a co-op arrangement where everybody brings their finest pigs or chickens, and they are processed together and they're packaged beautifully so they bring a high price in the city markets. That kind of promise is what it pays off the most rich dividends. I think there's not any doubt in the future that we're going to see increasing competition between the United States and China on political influence around the world, in economic affairs, and otherwise. I don't think this is bad, as long as we can retain our friendship and mutual understanding and some degree of accommodation of each other's basic societal structure and governments. We would prefer that all of China be a democracy, where every member of the Communist Party is elected through an open and free secret vote by all the people. They're not going to do that. And they pretty well tightened up on that prospect. In the meantime, though, the communists have done some things to make their process more democratic. There's a much more open access to Chinese communist leaders at the township and province level in choosing their delegates to go to the National People's Congress. And also the Chinese have imposed term limits, as you know, on the top leaders of China, with a pretty severe cutoff at a certain age limit. So Hu Jintao will not be the next leader of China after this 5-year period is over. Another one will come along. So this is not a perfect democracy. And the other problem between the United States and China is on human rights, particularly related to the Han Chinese, that's a dominant faction and ethnic group in China, and people that live in Tibet, or the Uyghurs who live in the far western part of China. And there's a great deal of pressure on United States leaders when they go to China to make a big deal out of those human rights violations in our terms of reference. So we have some problems between us, but as far as Taiwan is concerned, with the new leadership in Taiwan, there's been a remarkable development of friendly cooperative relationships between Taiwan and the mainland. And so the United States is not deeply concerned about Taiwan anymore. So that basically describes everything I know about China and the United States. And I'll be glad now to answer any questions that you might have. I'll be glad to have the representatives from the university to correct my mistakes.
President Carter, we all know that's as fine a talk on China in a half an hour that we will ever hear.
Oh, well, thank
You have a combination of your personal experience. Now, folks, the floor is open, and I'll call on you, but if you will.
Good.
Where you're from.
Anybody want to be on television? Any questions?
Hi, President Carr.
Hello.
My name is Xuhua Zhou. I'm a graduating senior at Emory University. So my major is business administration and study finance and accounting.
Right. Where are you from?
I'm from Shanghai. So
Okay.
I'm actually native Chinese. It's a very interesting topic here. I have, with regards to the economic situation relationship between the United States and China. So you see, right now there's a lot of pressure on the Chinese government to appreciate its currency, to make trade, to make the trade between the United States and China more balanced. What's your take on that? What's your perspective in terms of how fast the Chinese government should allow its currency to appreciate, and how much freedom should there be?
Well, as you know, the yuan now is tied to the dollar. And as the dollar has decreased in value, the yuan has also gone down. And there's a tremendous trade imbalance between China and the United States in that we buy a lot more from China than we sell to China. And a lot of pressure is placed on the president and on the United States government to try to induce the Chinese to increase the value of the Chinese dollar, of the Chinese yuan, which would make their products more expensive in China, and also would make it possible for Chinese to buy more products from the United States. So I think that the answer is that it would be better, I think, for the world economic community if China would increase the value of its currency, but I doubt that China is going to do it under pressure. This is a decision for China to make, and this means that we will continue to be deeply indebted to China. As you possibly know, the United States at this moment owes China about $800 billion. That is a tremendous amount of money. And China is our number one creditor. And whether we want to acknowledge it or not, when President Obama goes to China, in the back of his mind is always, we owe you $800 billion. And if you quit buying our bonds, we wouldn't have any easy way to finance our big deficits. And we're going to have a deficit this year of almost $1 trillion. And we couldn't finance the deficit in the United States government budget unless foreigners would buy our bonds and say, okay, we'll lend you money by buying your bonds. So this is another very big problem for us. There's another difference in culture that you didn't ask me about, but I think it's important. The Chinese are heavy savers. When a Chinese family earns a salary, they save about 50% of what they earn. And that goes into investments for the long term. The savings rate in the United States of America is, guess what? Zero. In our culture, we don't save anything. When I was president a number of years ago, we saved about 7% of our earnings. But lately, America has gotten to the point where we don't save anything. So that's another difference in basic culture. So I think, to summarize, we're going to continue to depend on the Chinese to finance our debt. As long as our dollar is reliable, and as long as the international community believes that we will pay off our bonds when they become due and continue to pay interest on the bonds. One savings grace now is for the United States taxpayer is that the interest rate on long-term bonds is very low. In the past, it's been up as high as 10 or 15%. Now it's down approaching 1% or 2%. So I think that over-answers your question.
My name is Cece, and I am from Atlanta, Georgia, and I was born in China. My question is, in your opinion, Mr. President, does the United States have grounds to push China to observe human rights, considering the Guantanamo Bay and wiretapping incidences involving the United States?
No. If we based our commitment to human rights on the recent performance of America at Guantanamo and in Al Ghraib prison and the abuses that have been perpetrated against American citizens under the George Bush administration, we would not have a right to criticize anyone else. But they are international commitments. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted by China and others when they became members of the United Nations. So China has signed the same very high standards for international human rights observance that has the United States. And just because the United States has violated its international commitments in recent years doesn't mean that China ought not to treat the ethnic groups that I mentioned, particularly the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, with great care and attention. I've been to Tibet, and I've met with Tibetan leaders. In fact, one of the Tibetans was in charge of the program for village elections when the Carter Center was involved at first. He was from Tibet, he was a Tibetan. And so I think that the main complaint by those people in those distant regions is that when the Han Chinese come in as outsiders and begin to live there, they begin to take over not only the economic leadership, but also culturally they insist that the minority ethnic groups comply with the Han Chinese majority culture elements. So I think it's good for the United States to remind China and other countries as well, and to remind ourselves that all aspects of human rights needs to be observed and violations need to be pointed out and corrected. But based on what happened in the previous 8 years, we don't have a right to criticize anybody. Thank goodness President Obama is correcting those crimes.
Hi, President Carter. Can you move this on? My name is Kevin Soderman. I'm a senior in the college. I'm from Warner Robins, Georgia. And my question is, in your opinion, since the normalization, since you left office, what period has been the most successful in U.S. China relations, and what policies on the U.S. side and what policies on the Chinese side facilitated that?
Well, there was a problem after I left office with both President Reagan, particularly him, and also before I became president with Nixon and Ford. Nixon announced there was one China, but it wouldn't really make clear which one we had normal relations with. And Ford also was under pressure from the right wing of the Republican Party, who still had an affinity for Taiwan. And at first, Reagan, during the campaign against me in 1980, condemned my reaching out to what he called Red China. So there was a kind of a stalemate then. In the meantime, though, China continued to take advantage of the reforms internally, and at least we maintained peaceful relationships with China. We didn't have any real confrontations concerning Taiwan. So I would say that in the last 30 years, it's kind of been up and down about how much cooperation we had with China. We now, I think, have pretty clear picture of what the future holds. So, maybe similar to what I just outlined, that we're going to be increasingly competitive. China is building up its military. They have a very high growth in the rate of military expenditures. China's military is still much inferior to ours. In fact, the United States military budget is equal to that of all the nations in the rest of the world combined, including the Soviet Union, Russia, and China, and everybody else. So I don't think there's any problem there. We have hope that China will help us increasingly in the United Nations. And that's a matter of some dispute. China has a very deep commitment against any sort of interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign country. So when we want to put pressure on the Iranians about their development of a potential nuclear weapon, or we want to put pressure on the government of Sudan about problems in Darfur, it's almost impossible for us to get the Chinese to join with us in the United Nations Security Council and condemn those countries, because China does not ever want in return to have the United Nations condemn China about something that happens in Taiwan or in Tibet. So that's one matter of contention between us. Lately, for instance, the United States has induced, I understand, Russia to join with us in strong condemnation of Iran as they purify uranium. The Chinese have not yet made that commitment. And I understand the Chinese about this. But some, many political leaders and editorial writers and so forth don't understand that China will never join in the condemnation of a government as to what it's doing in its own country, because it would set an unacceptable precedent for China. But other than that, I think that matters have gone up and down. I think now, as we understand China more clearly and become accustomed to China's dominance in trade and commerce, and begin to share with them a common problem with environment, we're going to grow together as well as grow apart in some measures. When I was in China a couple of years ago, the environment, about 5 years ago, the environment was in horrible shape. I was in a county not too far from Qingdao. I think it was Suping or something like that. And every stream in the county was so polluted that the farmers couldn't even use the water to irrigate crops. And I wanted to visit the premier and the prime minister, and they were on the seacoast at a resort where all the Chinese leaders go once or twice a year. And when I got to the seacoast, and you could only see a few hundred yards out over the ocean because of air pollution. China has now begun to change that because they recognize the damage to their own people, first of all. And now China's in the forefront of development of wind power and photovoltaic cells. And as you know, with the tremendous Yangtze River Dam project, on which they spent almost $40 billion, they've cut down the requirement for every little village to have its own coal-burning electric power plant. So they're making some moves in the right direction, so we need to join with them and make moves together.
Hello, Mr. President.
Hi.
It's on?
Go ahead.
Well, my name is Cristina Yang, and I'm a junior in the college, and I'm from Connecticut. And I was wondering, in your opinion, what the feasibility of a Chinese democracy is in the future, especially with regard to the size of the nation and the variety of minorities groups.
Well, I have to admit that when China first began to have village elections under Deng Xiaoping, I was very hopeful that if the village elections were successful, that process might be moved up one step to the cities, townships. And then if that was successful, move it on up and eventually have, free elections with everybody having a chance to vote to choose their ultimate leaders at the national level. That process, that trend that was not clear, but I think it was there, has been terminated. More recently, I would say under Hu Jintao, it's been stopped. Jiang Zemin was much more inclined toward, more liberalization. with democracy than the recent leaders have been. But I think that one of the reasons why the democratic trend has been terminated or held in abeyance, democracy as we define it, is the altercations that have arisen between the Communist Party leaders at the township level and the officials elected at the village level. When the people elect their own, what we would call mayor and city council, in a free election, after very spirited campaigning, they feel like they should have full authority over everything that relates to the village's life. But the ancient way of doing things has been for the township level members of the Communist Party to make decisions about that village, which comes into their territory. So there's been a lot of confrontations as maybe the Communist Party leaders say, why don't we put a big factory right next to that little village, and they make arrangements for the factory builders to come in and take some property, and the little villagers haven't had a chance to say where that factory will be or how it will be constructed and so forth. So there are a lot of confrontations now that have arisen between the little village people on the one hand and the Communist Party officials. And I think that has slowed things down. Somebody showed me a figure the other day that last year there were 40,000 reported incidences of that kind of arguments or public demonstrations. So I would say that, to answer your question, I think that the likelihood of China moving toward national elections for president or prime minister would be in the far distant future. My hope is, though, that the little village election process will be maintained and will continue. There is a move in the National People's Congress now to update the little village election law, and so that's an encouraging sign. So the little villages election process has been condemned by some of the right-wing, more conservative Chinese political leaders. They think they ought to be back the way they used to be a long years ago. But I think the little village elections now have a life of their own. I don't know if I've answered your question adequately, but I think it's an accurate answer.
Hi, Mr. President. I'm
Hi.
Andrew from Roswell, Georgia, and I was wondering. My question was, what are your thoughts or suggestions for students looking to make an impact on U.S.-Chinese relations?
I believe that the future of international relations is going to focus around U.S.-China relations. I think it's the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And there's no doubt in my mind that if a student is contemplating studying a language or becoming acquainted with a foreign economic and political system, that China would be the best choice. I don't think there's any doubt that trade relationships with China are going to continue to expand. And I think it's very important now and in the future for knowledgeable people about Chinese culture and politics to hold prominent places in the U.S. government and also in major corporations. This is very important, and I think that's maybe answered your question. I was able a little bit to help some American corporations right after we normalized relations. One was Coca-Cola Company, who got into China fairly early because they're from Georgia, and I was able to help a little. And the other thing that I was able to do was to help get 2 giant pandas in the Atlanta Zoo. When in 1972, after that, the Chinese permitted 2 pandas to come from Chengdu, China area, to Washington. And when I normalized relations, one of the things I wanted to do was to get two pandas to come to Atlanta. So I began to make moves on Deng Xiaoping when I was over there, and he agreed. But then the American Zoological Society and others around the world made a decision on a global basis that the giant panda arrangement should be changed to help preserve the continuity of the giant panda population. So they instituted some rules and regulations that were very difficult for a local city. Atlanta has to pay China about $1 million a year, I think, to keep the two giant pandas here. And that money goes to the Chengdu area to help preserve the environment for the giant pandas. But eventually, as soon as they worked that out, the giant pandas came to Atlanta. And now we have two baby pandas here, one male and one female. And I understand that we are now contemplating letting the female go back to China to be bred so she won't have to breed with her father or brother. and then maybe we'll continue that. So I've had a few things to do with China. But I think that, to answer your question, those students who've already chosen to study the Chinese languages and culture and economics and politics of China are making a very wise decision.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. My name is Alex O'Reilly. I'm from Boston, Mass, down at Emory studying political science and philosophy. I'm in Dr. Bullock's class on contemporary Chinese politics. I recently wrote a research paper on the Copenhagen Conference.
On what?
On the Copenhagen Conference.
Yeah.
China's role in that. You talked a lot about clean technologies that China's developing.
Yes.
Much of the research that I found pointed to the United States supporting China with clean technologies, both economically and technologically. Many people suggested that China didn't have the resources, the ability to develop clean technologies significant enough to reduce emissions in any sort of real way. So I'm wondering if you think that China has the commitment, the resources to develop and institute clean technologies in the future. If you think that the United States needs to support them, what the future of this is.
Okay. Well, I've talked to Hu Jintao and all his predecessors about the environmental issues in China. That have been very apparent to Chinese people, as I mentioned about the smog and streams and so forth, long before global warming came to the forefront of the international discussions. And the Chinese have long ago decided that they had to do something about the environment in China for the benefit of their own people. Air pollution was horrendous, and as you know, when China had their enormously successful Olympics, one of the things they did for weeks, even months ahead of time, was to make sure that the air over Beijing was fairly clean during the Olympic period, and it was. We were there not too long before the Olympics took place and saw that. So I'm not sure that the United States is in a position to be of great assistance to the Chinese. I wouldn't put the United States ahead of China in the technological developments concerning clean fuel consumption. From what I've read recently, and I only know what I read in Economist magazine and so forth, the Chinese are in the forefront. The Chinese also have a lot of money. The Chinese don't have any real limits on their budget. They can put $500 billion into economic stimulus without it bringing them into a deficit spending situation. So if they need a few $billion to initiate an institute to develop all forms of alternative energy, including wind power and photovoltaic cells and other things, they can certainly do it without the assistance from the United States. But to answer your other part of your question, if I understand it correct, I think the United States ought to be fully supportive. If there are scientific discoveries or anything else that we can share with the Chinese to help them in the effort that I've just described to you, I think we ought to be eager to do it, because now we know that environmental quality is a global problem, and what happens in China affects the people in America and vice versa. What happens in the rainforest of Brazil affects both of our countries. What happens in India with their rapidly increasing use of burning of fuel in automobiles affects both of us. I think that the Chinese have done quite well so far in making commitments to go to Copenhagen. As you know, in the Tokyo round, a number of years ago, I was over there to help prepare for the Tokyo round, and it was endorsed enthusiastically by George Bush Sr. in Rio de Janeiro. The United States was in the forefront of saying, we will comply with the Tokyo round restraints. George Bush Jr. abandoned it all and rejected it because China and India were not included, and he didn't want to arouse any opposition from the right-wing Republican industrial leaders. So now we are trying to play catch-up, and there's a lot of problems in the U.S. Congress. One advantage that a dictatorship has, like the Chinese, where a few leaders in Beijing can make a basic decision, is they can say, we're going to reduce CO2 emissions by 20% by 2020. They don't have to consult with anybody. The United States can't do that. We've now gotten the U.S. House of Representatives to say 20%. The Senate is considering 17%. We don't know if the Congress is going to pass anything. So Obama is going to go to Copenhagen. He's just decided to do that the last couple of days. After he gets the Nobel Peace Prize, he's going from there to Copenhagen to spend a day or two. And I think he and the premier the Prime Minister of China will be the two leaders there who will be most observed. But I think that the two countries ought to help each other in overcoming or addressing a common problem.
Good afternoon, President Carter. My name is Chris Willett, and I'm from Florida, and I'm a political science major and a junior at the college. Given that a lot of the legitimacy that the Chinese Communist Party gets is from the fact that they're able to foster a lot of economic growth, and given that that economic growth has sort of created a disparity in China, what do you think are the prospects for there being a lot of domestic internal strife in China, given that a lot of the legitimacy the Chinese government gets is from their ability to foster economic growth? And if there is, hypothetically, if there were ever to be an internal struggle in China, how should the U.S. respond? Thank you.
Well, I think the Chinese leaders are very sensitive about the prospect of what you just described, and very deeply committed to make sure it never happens. So there are two ways, obviously, to address that threat. One is to remove the causes of the dissension by making every effort to equalize the economic benefits from the boon that China is enjoying. And I don't have any doubt that China has made a lot of efforts to do that. They have seen for many decades that the economic advantages on the Pacific coastal area of China are much greater than they are in the far west. And you have to remember that China touches a lot of countries, including Afghanistan. It's hard to imagine. But, and they have made every effort to change that. That's one of the causes, by the way, of the human rights dissension that we mentioned earlier. When the Chinese go into Tibet or go into the Uyghur country to try to increase the per capita income, they naturally send in experienced Chinese entrepreneurs and others who know how to profit economically. And so they tend to become dominant in the local economy, and also to implant their own languages and their own way of worshiping ancestors or whatever, in competition with those indigenous people. So that's a trade-off that is always presented to me when I bring up the subject of human rights. We're not trying to change the Tibetans' way of life. We're just trying to help them have a better life and share the prosperity that we enjoy around Tsingtao and Qingdao and Beijing and so forth with those people back there. That's one of the problems. The second thing that China is trying to do right now is to improve health care in the rural areas. And 25 years ago, the so-called barefoot doctors in China were famous around the world as very innovative and sharing advanced preventive health care with very poor people. The only other country that challenged them and exceeded them, by the way, was Cuba. But China has that good reputation. That barefoot doctor health system has pretty well dissipated. And now the Chinese leaders recognize very clearly that they need to do something to cut down on the tremendous cost of health care among the poorest people. They can get health care, but it's very costly, and they don't have any universal insurance program that they need. But they are considering it, and that's one of the things that the Chinese have asked the Carter Center to work with them on, is to improve health care in the rural areas and to share some of the things we've learned in Africa with them in dealing with some diseases like schistosomiasis and so forth. So the other way, in addition to sharing the wealth, is to make sure that dissension is restrained. And I don't think there's any doubt that the Chinese will exert whatever authority they consider to be necessary to prevent any sort of violent disruption of their society or challenge to the central government. I mentioned earlier that the Chinese now have, in their opinion, a democratic form of government. But of course, it's all centered around democracy within the Communist Party. And I don't know what the latest figures are. Mary probably would know, but when I was president, only about 3% of the Chinese people were members of the Communist Party. Do you know? 70 million out of, so now 6%, say. Or say, 1 out of 16 people in China is a member of the Communist Party. And they're the ones that make the decisions about who will be the leaders. And the others are not directly involved in politics except in the village elections. So, but we've observed their system of choosing leaders, and it's fairly democratic once you become a member of the Communist Party. And the communists have been, in the last few years, they have reached out to, I would say, the elite young people. The Communist Party leaders are deliberately recruiting the brightest students and the most obvious future leaders to be members of the Communist Party, which is benefit both ways. But they are the ones that go to the conventions at the township level and in sometimes a hotly contested campaign situation, they choose the delegates to go from the township up to the county. And at the county, the same thing happens up to the provinces. And at the provinces, to send people to the National People's Congress. Sometimes they'll only have 6 candidates for 5 positions. And you actually voted for the one you don't want. But it's a free choice of the people involved. So I'm not defending their communist system, but that's the explanation that they give us. Steve? One more question. Sorry.
Here in the back. Last question.
Mike?
Thank you. Mr. President, my name is Li Yansheng. I study comparative literature and Chinese literature in U.S.
Yes.
I just have a question about copyright, since it has always been an issue for many years. My question is, some time ago, the Google company, they just put on the website a lot of works by Chinese writers without a legal process and without a agreement with the writers. I just wonder if U.S. Really want to have a sincere dialogue with China. Why could the government let those things happen? Even the issue of copyright has already been a problem. I mean, for many years.
Well, that remains a problem. Not only copyrights on writers, but also motion pictures, television programs, and other electronics, things that they cost a lot of money to produce, and quite often in China and many other countries, those things are copied off a TV screen or off a movie screen, and then sold, for $1 when the prevailing price might be $20. So that's a very serious problem. Google has worked out a very controversial agreement with the Chinese government, censors. I was watching Google's CEO Sunday night, I think on 60 Minutes, who was being interviewed about this decision. And he pointed out that Google had to accept the censorship of the Chinese government in what you can call up on the internet by calling up Google. I can get anything Google has. But a Chinese citizen can only get the things that the Chinese government has not censored out. And Google had to agree with that, or either not go into China at all. And their decision was to agree to it. So I think the dual question, they are related, of censorship by the Chinese government on what the people can see, and also the cheating by promulgating books and motion pictures and TV programs almost free of charge, where the author or producer doesn't get any benefit from it. Those two things have to be addressed quite seriously. The Carter Center has 2 websites in China. Both of them related to our small village election process. One of them is in English, the other one is in Chinese. And the director of our program is quite familiar, he's Chinese, he's quite familiar with the Chinese censorship restraints. Sometimes we put things on our website that we're not sure are acceptable to the censors. And it goes out all over China. And then if the censors come and say, you shouldn't have put that on there, then we have to take it off. But there's kind of a laxity about it, and I'm sure with Google as well, that lets the Chinese people have access to a lot of things that the Chinese government probably would not prefer. I don't really know the details of what an average Chinese scholar can do within a university environment in circumventing censorship and getting into free access to Google. But I do know that the electronic and literature rights are a contentious issue between the United States and the Chinese government.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.